Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 1424A, and today's date is November 13th, 2017, and the title of the episode is The Bailout Legislation Begins Before the System Collapses. Let's get into the economic collapse financial news. Now, lately we've been seeing a lot of corporations. I know they've been coming in with their earnings, telling you how great things are. And we see the retail industry and these huge corporations, well, they're going bankrupt. And a lot of corporations like Caterpillar and many others have closed many plants, laid off a lot of people. We know that GM has done this. And now we see that GE is out there, and it looks like they're running into problems. Now, of course, they've been trying to make us think that the economy has completely recovered. Everything is great. Corporations are selling where they're bringing in revenue. And we know, because we've been following this, the corporations, well, they've been basically buying back their stocks, laying off people, and showing that their earnings are fantastic. But meanwhile, their revenue, their sales, they're not there. And we know there is a huge pension problem. Now, GE, it looks like everything was fine until the CEO, Flannery, well, when he started to speak, that's when things started to go downhill. He said GE to borrow $6 billion for pension contribution. This shows us that in the private corporate world, there's a problem with pensions. Why? Well, first of all, they're underfunded. They also expected, 6, 7, 8% type of return. Not seeing it. The GE CEO went on to say, Alstom acquisition performing below expectations. We also see, he said that there's going to be a new, simpler earnings metric to focus on cash. And it doesn't look good for the future. So this tells us that there's major problems headed our way. Now, we talked about pensions before. Public, private, they're underfunded. I had many individuals on the X22 Report Spotlight talking about pensions and how this is going to be a huge problem. And many people are out there saying, well, is it really going to be a problem? We don't know because, again, you're not really receiving them. Corporations, the government, they keep everything under wraps. They really don't broadcast that, hey, we have a major problem here. But we understand that a lot of these pension programs, they're completely underfunded. They were expecting a certain rate of return. The interest rates were supposed to be at a certain area. All of it didn't happen. And the reason for this is because the central banks, they needed to keep the economy going. So they brought interest rates very low. And we could see at this point that there's a lot of investments where they are not doing as well as they thought they were going to do. Now, we understand that retail is imploding right now. Many corporations are shutting down. They're going bankrupt. Corporations, they're having a huge amount of problems. And we know there are pension problems. And we can tell right now that the government realizes that there's going to be major problems ahead of us. Now, the most defined benefit pension plans, they're nothing but Ponzi schemes right now. The plans are unraveling at this very moment. And there are certain individuals that are realizing this, and they're trying to get a jump on this. And what they're doing right now, and this is coming from Senator Sherrod Brown, they're going to unveil a multi-employer loan program legislation. Now, Senator Brown is a Democrat from Ohio. He plans to introduce this legislation that will allow struggling multi-employer pension funds to borrow from the U.S. Treasury to remain solvent. Now, the bill will also fund a program at the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corp to finance any remaining needs of pension plans borrowing from the new program. Any money needed for the PBGC would be a tiny fraction of what it would otherwise be on the hook for if Congress fails to act. Now, what he's saying is we need this legislation because if things go south and we wait, it's going to be a complete disaster. And this tells us that they realize that all these pension plans, they're they're going to implode on themselves. Now, it's important to note that the bill addresses private pensions covered by the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corp, not public pensions. And again, the public pensions, they also have a problem. There are over 200,000 retirees backed by 60,000 or so employees contributing to the plan. Moreover, the plan assumes a 6% return at a time when 10-year treasuries are at 2.4%. This cannot be sustained. And what we're seeing right now is that they are preparing to make sure that all of these pension plans, this is from private corporations, stay afloat using taxpayer money. Now, this is a bailout, just like we saw back in 2008 when they bailed out the automobile manufacturers, they bailed out AIG, they bailed out the financial institutions. Again, we're seeing the same thing occur once again. Now, if the economy is doing so great and everything is wonderful, why do we need bailout legislation? Because they understand when the system implodes and everything goes south, it's going to hit every single pension plan. And at that time, it's going to be much, much worse. So this tells us we are headed for very dark times. And they understand this. They see it. They know it. They're not broadcasting it out to the public, but they understand and they know what is coming. And this is why we've been telling everyone to get prepared. Now, the central bank, they finally did it. Since 2008, central banks have been desperately trying to generate inflation. They know they can't produce growth. Hence, this is why both the Fed and the ECB abandoned this as a goal in their statement back in 2013. So they've chosen to target inflation. To that end, central banks have maintained zero interest rate policy, as well as negative interest rate policy for the better part of 8 years. They've also printed $14 trillion in new capital and funneled it into the financial systems. Now, these two policies failed to create inflation for the simple reason that the money never made it into the economy. The banks they just weren't lending that money out. They were instructed, do not let this money hit the public. Why? Because if it did, that means there'd be a lot more dollars circulating in public, which would devalue the dollar even further, and there'd be inflation off the charts. This is why they kept it within the stock market. And we talked about this before, where they took inflation and it was pushed overseas, it was pushed into the stock market, it was pushed into housing, student loans, automobile industry, you name it. So all this cheap money just sat on the bank balance sheets and it was put into different locations, never hitting the public, and the velocity of money continued to drop in deflationary spiral. This is why we saw deflation. This changed in August of 2016. That's when the Bank of Japan began a policy of targeting a 0% yield on the 10-year Japanese government bond. Put simply, the Bank of Japan began a campaign of abject intervention in the bond markets, and it has unleashed a tsunami of liquidity into the system. Now, we know that the ECB, they decided to maintain their emergency levels of QE going into 2018, even though they're telling us that the economy is fine. Well, if the economy is fine, they wouldn't have to do this, but they know it's not fine, and this is why they're continually pushing this idea that we still need this emergency level of QE. This is just, to make sure that everything is okay. Now, why does this all matter? That the Fed, the EU, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan is doing what they're doing? Because the bond bubble trades based on inflation. We discussed this before. And when inflation rises, so do bond yields to compensate. When bond yields rise, bond prices fall. When the bond prices fall, the everything bubble bursts. Now, when we look at this, we can see that with inflation hitting now, and they actually met their target, which is ridiculous. We've been seeing inflation all over the place, and we're going to see a lot more inflation because it's starting to heat up right now because the central banks are loosening and pushing liquidity into the economy. We're going to see much more inflation. And what we're seeing is that all of a sudden, the bonds are going to be in trouble. The everything bubble is going to be in trouble. And we see right now that the individuals in government, the central banks, they all know what's going on here. They know that they can't keep this system at this level because what's happening behind the scenes, and when I say this behind the scenes, I'm not talking about the secret government or anything like that. I'm talking about behind the scenes where the actual people of each one of these countries, they're losing their jobs. Retail is imploding. The housing market is suffering. We're starting to see inflation. The pension system is a complete and utter disaster. They're completely insolvent. And they're going to implode. And we're going to see a lot of unhappy people. And the unemployment rate is fake, phony, and false. Most of the people have part-time jobs, no full-time jobs. Wages are continually declining. And people can't go out to retail and purchase anymore. And when you put all this together, it's a disaster. Now, since people have been getting part-time jobs and their wages have been declining, the tax receipts have not been moving up, but the debt has. So we don't have enough to fund the debt. Now, if the interest rates tick up, and this is why the Fed is holding back, guess what? It's going to be even harder to pay the debt. So right now, the central banks are stuck. The pensions are going to implode because they can't get the rate of return. They have to keep the interest rates low, or we default on the debt, and the housing market collapses, the automobile market collapses. Actually, we're seeing the banks already tighten, and they're not handing out as many subprime loans as they once did because they're starting to realize that there's major problems out there, and they've basically put themselves in this corner. And they have no other place to go here. And the whole thing is crashing down around them. Think about your own household. And you keep putting more and more debt on the credit cards. And you have about, 10 to 15 credit cards. And each one has $10,000 to $15,000 on it. And you're making $50,000 a year. And you just bought a new car. And another new car. And you decided to send your child to college where you took out a loan. Eventually what happens is that all of it cannot be sustained on a $50,000 income where you're not getting any type of cost of living raise. You're adding more debt and it's getting worse and worse and you have to borrow more to make the payments, but you can't sustain this. And eventually what happens, and it doesn't happen that, right off the bat, it takes time, and eventually you have to declare bankruptcy one way or another. And this is what's happening to the U.S. government. This is what's happening to the global economy. They kept doing this over the years. And they kept doing it and doing it and doing it, adding more debt, trying to fix all these problems that cannot be fixed because their product is debt. And the government, they're not going to fix anything. They're going to borrow more money because they have no way out of this. And they like to make money. So we are headed down this path, and it's coming to an end. And when we come to this point where everything just implodes, that's what's going to happen. It's going to implode. And people are going to be angry. People are going to be pissed off. And we're getting closer and closer to that point. I mean, if we look a couple of years ago, when we just talked about retail, and we just talked about housing, and we just talked about the debt, look where we've come. The debt has increased substantially. I mean, since 2008. We're up to 20 trillion. We started at what, 9 trillion? I mean, look at retail stores. Not many, there were stores closing. But during this recovery, we're seeing many more stores close as the unemployment rate continually declined, which makes no sense. So we can see right now their entire plan, it's coming to an end, and they won't be able to control this. The whole thing will just come down. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.